So welcome to our last lesson on science, technology, and society. So in the previous lessons that we've looked at really large concepts: science, technology, society, political context, social context, modernization, globalization, competition, scientific attitudes, the new normal, and the fourth industrial revolution. And all of these issues, they are so big, they encompass the whole of the global society. And for this last lesson, we would like to go a little bit microscopic, and let's look at the local. Let's look at how we could understand indigenous sciences and what is their place in science, technology, and society, and how can indigenous knowledge have a good relationship with science. So this lesson is entitled Understanding Indigenous Sciences, Nativization of STS. So, what are we going to be discussing today? So first, we'll try to question and understand the dominance of Western Modern Science, or WMS. Now, we've been discussing scientific method. We kept on criticizing it. We also looked into its contributions to society and how the innovations come from the sciences, the hard sciences, is a big factor why we are in the modern world that we are in today, and why we have all of these conveniences. And then we get and to understand indigenous science and traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK, and we're going to discuss about the contributions of indigenous science and TEK in the body of knowledge and in understanding our realities. So we discussed this in our early lessons, the scientific method, and how it has become the universal way of coming to know the truth about reality, about how we should do things in the social world and in the natural world, and how this method is superior to other methods in terms of understanding how society and how the world works. But in the beginning pa lang, we already started criticizing why Western modern science is dominant and why this continues to be the most important way to know about reality. And those things that do not align with this type of knowledge is easily minoritized or discriminated against in our society. So WMS, known as Western modern science or white male science, from a feminist perspectives, as we know, a lot of our scientists that really move how we understand reality are usually males, and they're usually Eurocentric, whites. And of course, we begin the assumption that WM is largely European. It's where most of our post-industrialized countries are. And of course, Europeans, they are colonizers. And of course, when they colonized, majority of the world, they also started to transmit the scientific methods and replace the indigenous methods that the countries that they colonized had in terms of understanding reality and the world around us. And in many ways, WMS continues to be a way to legitimize local knowledge. Parang at the end of the day, parang acupuncture, acupressure, they seem like really foreign and unusable concepts if it is done by a traditional healer. But when a doctor, an MD, starts tinkering around and looks into the science behind acupuncture, suddenly acupuncture and acupressure becomes acceptable. When we talk about herbal medications, usually it's a discriminated form of healing for people. But when it is repackaged by a pharmaceutical company from lagundi leaves that you just simply boil and drink to treat your cough, and they turn it into medicine, they turn it into a syrup, they turn it into tablets and capsules, suddenly it becomes a legitimate way to cure your cough for the general population and not just the believers of traditional knowledge. So, for so long a time, we've been saying, indigenous knowledge is acceptable. But really it is acceptable only when Western modern science says it is acceptable, when it still follows, the experimentation of scientific method. And for so many years and for many centuries, WMS continues to gatekeep which we can accept as truths about reality. And this is not to say that WMS is wrong in terms of its interpretation of reality. At the end of the day, our interpretation of reality is very much dependent on our senses. And as human beings, our senses are super duper limited. However, WMS, while it is very reliable, from a social science perspective, it can also become discriminatory, and it can also be a cause of oppression of those who try to survive using their own knowledge that they got from their indigenous practices and indigenous beliefs. However, more and more, science educators are seeing the importance of not just presenting scientific method among students and seeing that science attitudes are important, but also because we have a lot of students that are also coming from different cultural backgrounds now. We see now more diverse students coming into us, and we also see a lot of indigenous peoples and their children attending formalized classes. They don't see themselves in the science that is being taught. And so science educators and advocates of indigenous knowledge are arguing that maybe we can also teach scientific methods side by side with indigenous knowledge. And we should also promote this. And there could be a way that Western modern science and indigenous knowledge can collaborate in order to, understand reality more and solve our modern problems. But before we move into that discussion of how indigenous knowledge and Western modern science can really collaborate without being discriminatory to each other, let's define what indigenous science is. So according to Ogawa, this is also a very important STS figure who, defines and conceptualizes science. Ogawa defines indigenous science as a culture-dependent collective rational perceiving of reality. So it's culture-dependent. It is contextualized to a specific cultural group, unlike scientific method, which is a very universalist perspective. It almost does not consider subjectivity and social context in the way it derives reality. And it's also called ethnoscience, the study of systems of knowledge developed by a culture to classify objects, activities, and events of its given universe. So the way it is able to create meaning in the objects and the practices that they have, and make use of these meanings to interact with each other and communicate with each other and help each other and cooperate in order for them to survive in the specific geographical area where they're found. Now, in terms of indigenous science, their biggest contribution to general knowledge building is to traditional ecological knowledge, or TEK. Ecological, so it talks about, living with the environment and, of course, taking care of the environment and the living things that live in that environment. So it's a cumulative body of knowledge and beliefs handed down through generations. So that's one of the important context here, no? It's something that lasted sometimes even longer than positivism, which is of course the ideology of science, has stuck around in the 1800s. And most of the traditional ecological knowledge that we know and has been taught to indigenous people have been present way before the science that we are doing now has existed. About the relationship of living beings, including humans, with one another and with their environment, usually found in non-industrial societies like our indigenous peoples and our tribal groups. Now, compared to modern sciences that understands ecology and the environment, there are certain common characteristics of traditional ecological knowledge that basically is patterned in many agricultural and non-industrial societies. The first one is that environmental issues and social issues, they overlap. Because remember, in our early societies, the hunter-gatherer societies, they really interact almost 100% of the time with their environment. They try to understand it and integrate it in their social lives in order for them to survive. They don't have a complicated social system. No, they don't have interdependence, they don't have specializations. All of them do the same thing. They deal with the environment, they take resources from it, they make use of it in order for them to survive. You know, they try to memorize and deal with it from their own perspective. No, and it's integrated in their social life. So yeah, it's environmental and social. Next is that TEK is moral instead of value free. And you know, this is common even in our own IPs in the Philippines, those coming from Ifugao, the Aitas, the Dumagats. They really have high regards on their environment and the things that they see in the environment, both living and non-living. And because they place moral meanings on their environment and the objects that they find in it, they take care of it, diba? And like, you know, most Western modern science, our view about the environment, especially during the earlier times, is to exploit it, to understand it, in order to exploit it, to develop things from it, so that we'll be able to make our lives more easier and more comfortable. And of course, you see where it got us now, no? We have a very polluted environment, we have climate change issues. Next, TK is observed across lifetimes, passed through one generation to the next. So as I was telling you, no, sometimes TEK of certain indigenous peoples are so much more old compared to the birth of science. No? They have been passed on for so many centuries and decades from one generation to the next. So the science or the knowledge that they get from the environment and how they deal with the environment, this is something that, you know, their great ancestors have passed on them, and that's the wealth of knowledge that they have in relation to their specific environment. So ayun nga yung nabanggit ko, no, it's transmitted across generations via oral histories. When you say oral histories, yung kwento ng the older generations to the younger generations. And oral histories are very important, no, because that's the way that they keep the knowledge, no, within their tribe or within their indigenous group in order for them to survive the environments, no. And they do this via oral traditions. No? When say oral traditions, kasama na sa kanilang tradisyon in their indigenous group, no, in their cultural group, to pass on the knowledge from an older generation to a younger generation, and then of course later to a younger generation. And that's also the reason why some of the Aita Dumagats, they're quite concerned about their children or their younger generation accessing cell phones. So there's actual study that certain Dumagat parents, they do not let their children have access to cell phones because their argument is that unless they're 18, we want them to be educated first with the oral traditions of the indigenous peoples, because they fear that when they are distracted by the innovations that are found in cell phones, they get a wealth of knowledge from, you know, from internet, which is of course boundless. They might not have space in their consciousness about the oral traditions. At ang fear nila, baka matapos in the generation yung oral traditions that have been passed on to many generations. And, you know, you have heard of stories about, you know, language dying because, you know, it wasn't transmitted fully to the younger generations. And unlike Western modern science, who speak of science and jargons and technical stuff, usually the understanding of the environment among indigenous peoples, you make use of metaphors, symbols, and stories. Kaya nga siya oral histories. It's a narrative, it's a story. And the reason why they make use of metaphors, symbols, and stories is that, you know, It elevates the meaning of the practice that they have with the environment so that it can be more appealing to the younger generation so that they will be able to keep it. And kahit naman in Western modern science, we make use of analogies and metaphors in order for us to memorize even the hardest concepts in science, right? You know, we even use hugot and relationships, no, para i-explain yung relationship ng mga molecules and everything. So, I think that's the same thing that they're doing here. It's just that it's outside Western modern sciences, kaya madalas na discriminate. And all over the world, and even just in the Philippines, there's a lot of traditional ecological knowledge that we have and that we can learn from our indigenous peoples. And the areas where they have knowledge on spreads into many, many disciplines. No, they have contributions to ecology. Sa Pilipinas, we have a lot in terms of botany. We have a branch of botany we call ethnobotany. When we say ethnobotany, these scientists, what they do is that they visit indigenous peoples and they ask these indigenous groups how they make use of the plants in their environment. No, so that of course we can also make use of the good ways that they could use it, because there might be something that scientists don't know yet about how we can use plants, and there are a lot of funding for ethnobotanical studies, because nga we are gearing towards increasing commercialization of herbal medications. So we're trying to learn biology also, medicine. Madami tayong natutunan medicine, no? Acupuncture, acupressure, herbal medicine, Reiki therapy, Tai Chi, etc. Agriculture, glaciology from the Eskimos, climatology, di ba? May ways din ang indigenous peoples in relation to how they identify, without a calendar, na time na for harvest or time na for tawag dito planting, crop rotations. Even without calendars, they know. Geology, architecture, astronomy, di ba marami din silang alam in relation to how the stars are aligned, di ba? We also learned a lot from the way they view the universe. Metallurgy, nautical science, military science, navigation, engineering, mathematics. Going back to nautical science, di ba, if you remember si Moana, di ba, may specific silang way of navigating the seas based on their indigenous knowledge. Yan. Now, how do they come to know their traditional knowledge? They do usually the same thing that they do in science methodology. They observe, they question, they infer, they predict, they do problem solving, they classify practices, they classify the objects that they find in the environment, they place meaning on this and these objects, and from there they decide on the actions that they have on these objects, living or non-living in their environment, monitoring, interpreting, adapting. They still do the same thing that we do in science. They just don't follow the strict technical rules of it. But definitely, in the many, many years that they have been around, the indigenous peoples have been around in our world, definitely they have done all of this. Hindi lang nila na-document in a technical way, and the way they transmit this knowledge and disseminate this knowledge is within their group lang via oral traditions, as I explained earlier. And they're guided by, traditional wisdom. And of course, when you look at most indigenous cultures, meron silang mga pagkakaiba in relation to their artifacts, yung pananamit nila, yung mga gamit nila, which is also very much dependent on their environment. But, those anthropologists who study about indigenous cultures have also found commonalities, cultural universals among these indigenous people, and, you find their own ways of doing respect. They have their own framework for ethics. They have controls, sharing, harmony, reciprocity, holism, and spirituality. These are common traits that indigenous peoples have, and that guides the way they understand the world. And then, these are integrated into their local cultural perspectives. And when you see indigenous cultures, they live in sustainable, geographic areas, di ba? nagfo-flourish yung kanilang area even without industrialization. They survive even without industrialization. And they make their environment flourish and be sustained. Diba? And this could have implications for resolving global environmental problems. Now, we can learn a lot from the way they are dealing with their environment in order for us to deal with our own environmental problems as well. So, yun yung mga ways and potentials wherein TEK and WMS can collaborate. And as explained earlier, the common wisdom of TEK that is seen across indigenous cultures include that all forms of life must be respected as conscious, intrinsically invaluable, and interdependent. So they have an understanding on the importance of the existence of biodiversity in their area, and they, of course, have been taught by their previous generations to take care of all living and non-living things in their environment, diba? And this is something that we observe in indigenous peoples. And I think one of the reasons why hindi masyadong nagko-connect ang WMS with TEK is because, indigenous people believe and are invested in the supernatural, in the spiritual, and how the spiritual is connected with humans and nature. But we also have to remember that because they have high beliefs that spirits live in the animals, the plants, and the environmental objects that they see, that's the reason why they take care of it, because they put so much meaning on this environmental entities, diba? So merong functional significance ang pagli-label nila ng mga bagay as spiritual or supernatural, because when they label it like that, they take care of it. And really, when you think about it, when you talk about, religious groups, aren't we also like that? Like, we also place spiritual values on things. Like, for example, you can, tear any page of any book, but if you tear the page of a Bible, it feels like it's a grave sin. We place so much meaning on the cross, and we revere the cross, we revere the statues, and then we take care and protect them. It just so happens that indigenous people, they believe that everything that they touch, that they live together with in their geographical area, has spiritual functions. They have spiritual virtues that they have to take care of, and that's the reason why they take care of the environment, because they believe that that they're being taken care of the supernatural beings that live within their environment. Now, when WMS scientists collaborate with indigenous peoples in relation to understanding the environment more from the perspective of the indigenous peoples, they also have to listen to oral traditions, right? And of course, WMS scientists, they also have to kind of look into the value of the oral traditions and how it could be possibly closer to the truth that they can tinker with from the side of WMS. And some of the characteristics that they look into when they are hearing oral traditions of ecological practices from indigenous people are, first is persistence, meaning matagal na tong storya na to. It has lived so many years. So, it increased the value and the truthfulness of the oral tradition increases when, of course, it persists through time. Next is individual variation and consistency. So, if you interview all elders in indigenous culture, an indigenous group, and they say the same thing, then it might probably be a true and a useful tool for ecological management. So variation and consistency. Also, we have to understand that oral tradition is a technology that is common in all indigenous peoples, because again, cultures, practices, values, beliefs, they survive via oral tradition. And so oral tradition is a tool for cultural survival and passing on of the cultural capital. And of course, WMS scientists also look into the duration of observation. Syempre, the longer they have been observing the phenomenon that they're looking at, the tendency is that they know more about it. One of the limitations that they have in relation to oral tradition is the absence of documentary sources, or probably they have documentary sources but they are from a different language or dialect na hindi naiintindihan ng WMS. And also, in understanding oral traditions from a WMS perspective, they always have to understand that, the oral traditions and the ecologic practices that they are sharing come with a cultural context. So, ginagawa nila ba ito because there is a certain belief that supernatural beings live in this living beings and in this stone, in this tree. That's why they're taking care of it. So that, you can better understand why they're doing their ecological practices the way that they're doing it. And of course, study very much the literary styles and the symbolisms that are found in the oral traditions, and to be able to see the things that they place importance to. And then one of the issues then in terms of oral tradition is it's difficult to be able to pin down temporal and spatial relations to the phenomenon that they're describing, especially if they have a different perspective of time and space compared to the modern world, which is the calendar, the seconds, the minutes. Minsan kasi iba ang kanilang time and space orientation, no? And then of course, lack of quantitative data in order for them to be able to verify the truth. Not really verify the truth, but verify and be able to test whatever ecological practice that they're doing. So what are the contributions of traditional ecological knowledge to Western modern science? First, TEK can provide science researchers with important biological and ecological insights that may not be found in the books, but then further enriches it, no? Especially when they talk about the usage for their survival, then it could give more insights to scientists for them to further study. Next, it provides effective and cost-effective shortcuts for researchers investigating the local resource base. So yun nga, sinasabi natin, for instance, in an ethnobiological study, somebody says na itong plant na to, ginagamit namin ito para sa sugat. Then, the scientist can already spin down his research problem in understanding this plant as anti-inflammatory or antibacterial. Diba? Hindi niya na iti-tease out yung ibang possibilities kasi natulungan na siya ng indigenous culture, ng indigenous people na inarrow down yung kanya magiging focus. Now, his goal now is to be able to understand, why is it effective for them to make use of this plant for their wounds, and probably looking at the anti-inflammatory or antibacterial properties of the substances found in that plant. Next, it helps define protected areas and can be used for natural resource management. Because, of course, they know about the species that are found in their area, and some of them could be endangered. So, we get to already find na, this area should be protected, and we can already assign them, let them be the safeguards of that area. Protected areas may be set aside to allow the resident communities to continue their traditional lifestyles, and usually the traditional lifestyle that they have might be contributing to the safeguarding and sustaining of the living and the non-living entities in their environment. And more importantly, TEK provides time-tested, in-depth knowledge of the local area. Time-tested kasi, diba, if what they're doing is not working, then their indigenous group should have existed for that long of a time. Right? So, it's time-tested, no? Kasi nakasurvive sila eh. So, meaning, how they deal with the environment is working. It's effective, no? And it provides in-depth knowledge because, these people, they're not exposed to the outside world. They're not exposed to the informational bombardment that we have here in the modern world. So, their knowledge building is focused on their locality. And therefore, what they know about their locality is so rich because they are not exposed to the informational bombardment that we are having in post-industrial societies like Metro Manila. And these insights can provide more accurate environmental assessment and impact assessments, no? And yun lang kasi talaga eh, and especially in the Philippines wherein, our political systems are not very protective of our indigenous peoples. They're more in tune with corporations who see every block of land and see an opportunity for capitalistic gains without really understanding the ecological benefits in the long run of allowing indigenous people to maintain their lives in that geographic area. People who depend on local resources for their livelihood are often able to access the true costs and benefits of development better than any evaluator from the outside. So remember, when we do technological and social impact assessment for any type of technological or infrastructure project, we always have to ask the people who are stakeholders in these projects. No, include natin yung mga indigenous people that might be affected, might be displaced, and hear out the possible issues that they could have, not just socially but environmentally as well, because they have been living there for a long period of time. Actually, there is a study that I am attaching together with the learning materials about indigenous people from Ifugao, and they have already developed a system, in the rice terraces. No, they have developed a system of conserving water, no, to maintain continuous water irrigation, and they already also built, cultural practices around their environment, and this defined the morals in their community. Like for instance, how do they deal with, ownership of natural resources? For instance, pwede ko bang kunin yung twigs ng mga kapitbahay ko, right? Or ng mga kasama ko sa community? Kaya ako magpapaalam. And then we also get to learn in that article how they make, trades and deals. No, some of them pay using economic, money. Some of them does barter, no? Is yung itong piece of land ibebenta ko, and then ang ibabayad mo sa akin ay 3 baka, no? So they also have those kinds of cultural practices, and of course that's loaded with a lot of cultural meanings. But actually, the practice of irrigation that they have in the Muyong in Ifugao is already being considered as something that we can replicate elsewhere, na merong problema rin sa irrigation, sa water irrigation. Remember, in agricultural societies, water irrigation is so important, not only for the survival of the people but also for the survival of the crops. So, people, scientists, inspired by this anthropologic work, are inspired to replicate this for communities who have a hard time in maintaining good water irrigation, especially in mountainsides. Now, like I said, I think one of the reasons why WMS is very skeptical about traditional ecological knowledge is because of the spiritual basis of their practices, right? And of course, like we said, modern science that we know now rejects supernatural causes of any phenomenon. And ngayon, dyan sila nagka-clash, no? But we also have to understand, of course, we don't necessarily have to accept all the supernatural things. But generally, if it's valid for the people who are believing it, we allow them to believe it. No? We do not impose our religious and our scientific beliefs in them unless, of course, it's may human rights abuses doon sa kanilang paniniwalaan. We consider their beliefs as valid because that's their worldview. But in a spirit of collaboration, we understand that and we accept that, but we don't necessarily, of course, make use of that. No, it's not naman we don't accept everything that TEK says. No, we also have to check in terms of the universality of what they are practicing. No, so spiritual explanations often incorporate important ecology of conservation and sustainable development strategy. So yun nga, 'di ba? As I said earlier, may cultural functional significance din ang spiritual at supernatural explanations nila, 'di ba? If they believe that spirits reside in trees, in stones, in sand, in land, in every creature, in every plant, and that makes them take care of their environmental entities because of that belief, then why should we rob them of that belief if that increases their moral obligations for their environment? If that increases their positive regards towards the environment, then what is wrong with that? Spiritual dimension helps in communicating the oral tradition and can help direct action. So yun nga, 'di ba? Again, like we explained earlier, it's important for those who transmit the stories from one generation to the next to use symbolisms, and sometimes those symbolisms have spiritual basis, and that increases the impact of the stories that they tell to their younger generations. And there are already so many studies in the biological, in the natural sciences about things that have already been explored by indigenous people through their traditional ecologic knowledge, and have improved the way we understand ecology, the environment, and the living things that reside in these environments. Definitely, there are many issues in relation to collaboration. Like, for example, the ownership of intellectual property. It's very important that, kasi ang tendency niyan, sige, pupunta sa biologist, sa isang indigenous people. From there, he will learn about, extra characteristic of living creatures as the way they understand it through oral tradition, and then he publishes it. And then siya yung makakuha ng acclaim from, the scientific community. And those who were studying it for many, many generations and decades and centuries ago do not get any accolade at all. So, it's very important to also regard them with intellectual property rights as well. Ngayon naman yung storya ng Yakuwanoy people, di ba? Sometimes they get abused, their knowledge is being translated and commercialized, and then after scientists and corporations have gained profit from the knowledge that indigenous people have, wala na, itsepwera ng indigenous people. So we now have frameworks, and we have the National Commission on the Indigenous Peoples that help advocate and protect from these kinds of exploitations for our indigenous peoples in the Philippines. And of course, another issue is we were discussing earlier in Module 2, the importance of including modern scientific attitude among our students. But of course, in our society today, that's becoming more multicultural in nature, becoming more embracing diversity, it is also not just important to give our students modern scientific attitudes, but we also give them some sort of openness in relation to traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous sciences. And therefore, we can also start that among the young, especially those who are living in rural areas, who already have the traditions in their mind as told by their older generations. And, we ask the students to share their insights about the natural sciences. And of course, science educators should be able to incorporate this, make the students analyze the importance of Western science, but also the indigenous sciences in understanding the world, and of course trying to tease out, what could be applied in technical, in traditional ecological knowledge, and those that cannot be applied, because it could be harmful or it could be outdated. But of course, we do that very, very respectfully. So, in this video, we were able to learn about the dominance of Western modern science. We learned about the characteristic of indigenous science and traditional ecological knowledge, and we also look into the importance and the contribution of traditional ecological knowledge on Western modern science, and how this collaboration can possibly address some of our global issues today, especially in relation to environmental issues.